So today we're going to look at this video from PragerU, and for those who don't know, PragerU, it's a conservative YouTube channel which, as you can see, has over 3 million subscribers on YouTube. This video has over 628,000 views as of today. It was put up last October of 2022. It's titled Deuteronomy, Why It's Hard to Love God. Let's check it out.
Most of the wisdom of Western civilization, the civilization that has been the most successful in history in making good societies, comes from the Bible. That's why the Bible is the most influential book ever written. So I'll share with you some of the wisdom from just one book of the Bible, the 5th, Deuteronomy. 1. Do not show partiality in judgment, chapter 1, verse 17. A compassionate society is built on justice, not compassion. That might sound counterintuitive, but while we should be compassionate in our private lives, the state must be preoccupied with justice. That is the reason for this law. Judges are forbidden not only to show favor to the rich, but also to the poor. The purpose of a judge is to dispense justice.
All right, so this is actually a pretty good start. Essentially what I get from this is that the law should be applied to everyone and that judges of the law should treat everyone equally. However, when dispensing justice, it's worth highlighting some of the more troubling laws and commandments and, dare I say, barbaric punishments for violations, like right here in Deuteronomy 21, where the death penalty is prescribed by stoning to people who disobey their parents, such as getting a little too drunk, or like how in Deuteronomy 5 we're reminded of the 10 Commandments, one of which is to make the Sabbath day the day of rest. And at one point earlier in the Bible, in the book of Numbers, a man is punished with death for gathering sticks on the Sabbath day as directed by God through Moses. Or check out some of these rules in another earlier book in the Bible, Leviticus, like if a person says bad things about his mother or his father, you must kill him.
Uh-oh, SpaghettiOs!
If a man has sex with another man's wife, you must kill him and the woman. A man is sinning if he has sex with another man. You must kill both of the men. It also looks like if a man has sex with a woman during her period, they get exiled, if I'm understanding this correctly. And then there's this gem. A man or a woman who uses magic is doing a wrong thing. People must throw stones at that person until they die. Although not all of the rules in the Bible carry a harsh punishment. As expressed right here in Deuteronomy 22, if a man rapes a virgin woman, his sentence is to pay the father 50 pieces of silver because I guess the father is the real victim in this heinous crime.
You absolutely suck!
And rather than be punished with death or imprisonment or exile, the rapist is expected to marry the victim. So sure, it is nice that judges are expected to apply the law to everyone equally, but are we sure that this is the sort of justice that we want dished out?
No, of course not.
Interesting that good old Dennis Prager does not mention any of these wonderful teachings from Deuteronomy.
2. Do not be afraid of anyone. Also chapter 1, verse 17. Every human being has fears. The question is, whom do we fear? And for most people, only if you fear God will you not fear men. Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the few Germans to actively oppose the Nazi regime, and who was executed for doing so, feared God more than Hitler. If more Germans had feared God more than they feared Hitler, and if more Russians had feared God more than they feared Stalin, tens of millions of people would not have been murdered.
I find it strange that Dennis makes this point, considering that Deuteronomy is full of passages talking about the absolute destruction of entire civilizations. Like right here in Deuteronomy 2, talking about how we killed King Sihon and all of his sons and all of his soldiers. At that time, we took all of his towns and we gave everything as a gift to the Lord. We killed the men, women, and children. We left nobody alive. And right here in Deuteronomy 3, talking about how the Lord our God put Og, king of Bashan, under our power, as well as his whole army. There were 60 cities. All the cities had high walls around them with the gates that the people locked. There were also very many villages which did not have walls around them. We destroyed them completely as a gift to the Lord. We destroyed every city and we killed all the men, women, and children. And then we have Deuteronomy 4, where God talks about how he is chasing out other nations so that you can take their land to live in. And then we have Deuteronomy 7, talking about all of these different nations that God has in mind, about how the Lord your God will put those people under your power so that you can win against them. When that happens, you must destroy them completely as a gift to God. This is what you must do to the people of those nations. Break their altars and their stone pillars into pieces, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their idols with fire. And in Deuteronomy 12, God talks more about his hard-on for conquest, talking about how you will chase out the nations who live there, then you must destroy completely all the places where those people worship their gods. But back to the PragerU video, this assertion that brutal dictatorships like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were a consequence of people rejecting God or not fearing God enough. From what I can tell, this appears to be a common talking point with Dennis Prager.
It is not a coincidence that the rejection of Judeo-Christian values in the Western world by Nazism and communism led to the murder of all these innocent people.
I'm of the opinion that these brutal dictatorships were not a result of a rejection of God, but rather these brutal dictatorships were a result of a rejection of reason and individualism. For more on this topic, I highly recommend checking out Leonard Peikoff's The Ominous Parallels.
Read a book, read a book, read a motherfucking book. Read a book, read a book, read a motherfucking book.
3. You will find him if you seek him. Chapter 4, verse 29. Just as finding a spouse can take years of searching, so too finding God can take years of searching. But, like a good spouse, the effort is worth it. Without God, life has no ultimate, no objective meaning. If there's no God, every one of us is as insignificant as a grain of sand. It's not a coincidence that as fewer Americans take God and religion seriously, suicide and depression rates have risen dramatically.
I think it's worth noting that in Deuteronomy, spoiler alert, Moses dies in the end. And throughout Deuteronomy, we're reminded that Moses, one of the pivotal figures in the Bible who dedicated his life to God's cause, leading the Israelites out of Egypt, speaking with God and doing all of God's work, dealing with these sinners and complainers and doubters and a bunch of other drama amongst the Israelites. And after all those years of Moses dedicating his life and his effort to God's cause, we're reminded in Deuteronomy that God decides to not let Moses into the promised land because Moses did not whisper into a rock to get water as God commanded, but rather Moses hit the rock with a stick to get water. So a lesson I take from Deuteronomy is that even if you find God and dedicate your life to God's cause, that you might get rewarded with a spiteful punishment for merely not whispering into a rock. As to whether or not my life has meaning with or without God, considering that God is constantly using people as pawns, sending plagues and natural disasters and conquerors to punish his chosen people for abandoning and or doubting God and giving his prophets barbaric codes of laws to live by. Considering all of this, I'm of the opinion that my life has much more meaning in a universe without the God of the Old Testament.
4. You shall have no other gods before me. Chapter 5, verse 7. We have more gods in modern life than idol worshippers had in the ancient world. Just to cite one of a dozen examples, many secular people believe in science the way religious people believe in God and the Bible. But there's a big problem with that. Unlike God and the Bible, science has nothing, simply nothing, to say about good and evil or about the meaning of life.
And yeah, God sure is serious about not worshiping other gods. Deuteronomy 4 reminds us that God once commanded that some of his chosen people be killed for worshiping another god, before reminding us that anyone who makes idols will die.
5. Love God with all your heart. Chapter 6, verse 5. Given all the unfair suffering in the world, it's difficult for many people to love God. I admit, I am one of them. God knows this love is difficult. That's why Deuteronomy commands us to love him. It's an amazing commandment, and it's amazing in another way. Deuteronomy is the first book in history to present a God who loves human beings and who wants human beings to love him.
Of course, Dennis is leaving out all of the consequences of not loving God. Dennis Prager cites chapter 6 of Deuteronomy, yet in this same chapter later on, God says that if you worship other gods, he will be very angry with you and that he will destroy you from this earth. And then going back to Deuteronomy 5, where we are reminded of the 10 Commandments, we're reminded that God will punish anyone that speaks ill of the Lord or for worshiping false idols. Also in Deuteronomy 10, we're told that you should live in a way that pleases the Lord, love him and serve him in everything that you think and everything that you do. I don't know, sounds kind of creepy.
6. Repeat them again and again to your children. Chapter 6, verse 7. Parents need to teach their children wisdom and moral values all the time. In the words of Deuteronomy, talk about them when you're at home, and when you're on the road, and when you go to bed, and when you get up. Otherwise, others, such as morally confused teachers and social media, will teach your children neither wisdom nor good values.
Yes, it is very important that you constantly remind your kids about God and his teachings, because as often discussed in the Bible, whenever future generations forget about God, God allows terrible things to happen to them. And going back to the commandment about worshiping false idols, it is explicitly stated in Deuteronomy that God promises to punish your children and grandchildren if you violate this commandment. So yeah, whatever you do, do not let your kids forget about God or there will be consequences.
7. You shall be happy. Chapter 12, verse 7. That there is a biblical law to be happy is what has shaped my entire approach to happiness. That it is a moral obligation, not just an emotional state.
Well, first off, I'm not sure that this particular verse prescribes a moral obligation or law to be happy. From what I can tell, it just says that you will be happy after you're done obeying God's commands and teachings or whatever. I think it's also worth remembering that this verse comes after the chapter starts off with talking about destruction of other civilizations. We also see this in Deuteronomy 6, where it mentions that you will be happy in everything you do after you obey the Lord's commands. Let's also not forget that in Deuteronomy 8, it's mentioned that God made everyone suffer in the desert for 40 years just to test them. So I guess God's chosen people should have just been happy to suffer. And later on in Deuteronomy 8, it's sort of implied that God says that you should not be proud or you should never think of yourself as clever because, hey, it's God that gives you strength. And I'm over here thinking, don't many people often derive happiness from stuff like success and achievement? Here in Deuteronomy 10, it says, obey the Lord's commands and rules that I am giving you today. If you do these things, you will have a happy life. So yeah, I guess you'll only be happy so long as you do what the man says. It sounds like this book was written by a mafia boss. And then in Deuteronomy 14, we get rules about food, which is where we get the part about not eating pigs. So yeah, I guess you have a moral obligation to be happy. That is, unless you get enjoyment out of eating bacon or other delicious pork products. And in Deuteronomy 15, we can see that God condones slavery. So yeah, I guess if you're one of the lucky ones that gets enslaved, you still have a moral obligation to be happy, to the extent that you can find happiness as someone else's property. And this is besides the point, but since we're talking about Deuteronomy, I found it strange that in one chapter, God commands to punish false prophets with death. Then in a later chapter in Deuteronomy, Moses tells everyone that they can expect another prophet in the future to speak to the people, which I think puts everyone in a bit of a pickle, considering that it's impossible to verify whether or not a prophet is a false prophet. I don't know, a lot of stuff in this book just does not make sense. Anyway, back to the happiness part. Maybe it's not the worst thing in the world that Dennis Prager promotes happiness as a virtue, even if he comes to this conclusion from a bizarre interpretation of Deuteronomy. But going back to the title of this video, why it's hard to love God. For those who don't know, I started reading the Bible back in October. I've been doing it live on Twitch streams, and at the time of this recording, I'm currently nearing the end of the book of Samuel. And if I'm being honest, reading the Bible firsthand has made me like the God of the Old Testament even less than I did before.